Hello everyone! Today's the big day, the day some of you may have been looking forward to and some of you may have been dreading. In this video, I'm going to take a look at the pivotal events described in chapter 26 of Jane Eyre by Charlotte Brontë and how 9 different versions adapted them for the big and small screens. As I was working on this review, I realized with some alarm, that's an understatement, that what we're really looking at here is 2 scenes, but because they're rolled into one, I really can't split the content into 2 parts. So if this video is freakishly long, I apologize. That's why. As usual, we're going to begin with a summary of the section. The chapter starts with Jane getting ready on her wedding day. Rochester's impatient, rushing her through breakfast, and then hurrying to the church, walking with such speed and determination that they have to pause for a minute for Jane to catch her breath. As they near the church, Jane notices 2 men entering by the side door. She figures they've come to witness the wedding, which is otherwise guestless. But when the priest asks if there's any impediment, any lawful reason why these 2 should not be joined together, one of the men steps forward. I've got to say, at every wedding I've been to, as a lifelong Jane Eyre fan, when the question comes up, if anyone knows of any reason, speak now or forever hold your peace, I always think of this scene, which is kind of a dark thing to think about at a wedding. Rochester tries to ignore the interruption and make the confused priest continue with the ceremony, but the stranger, a solicitor named Briggs, explains that the marriage cannot go on because Rochester has a wife now living at Thornfield Hall, and to prove this, he presents a witness, Richard Mason. Thus it's revealed that 15 years ago, Rochester married Mason's sister Bertha in Jamaica. With the truth out there, Rochester has little choice but to acknowledge that yes, it's true. The rumored madwoman living at Thornfield Hall is his wife. He adds, however, that he was ignorant of her hereditary insanity when he married her. He grimly invites everyone to the house to meet his wife, and they all go up there, Mason demonstrably nervous as they enter the room where he was attacked a few months ago. There they find Grace Poole cooking over a fire and a figure. What it was, whether beast or human being, one could not at first sight tell. It groveled seemingly on all 4s. It snatched and growled like some strange wild animal, but it was covered with clothing, and a quantity of dark grizzled hair, wild as a mane, hid its head and face. Grace Poole warns Rochester to be careful, and sure enough, Bertha springs at him. Mr. Rochester flung me behind him. The lunatic sprang and grappled his throat viciously and laid her teeth to his cheek. They struggled. She was a big woman, in stature almost equaling her husband, and corpulent besides. She showed virile force in the contest. More than once she almost throttled him, athletic as he was. He could have settled her with a well-planted blow, but he would not strike. He would only wrestle. At last he mastered her arms. Grace Poole gave him a cord, and he pinioned them behind her. With more rope, which was at hand, he bound her to a chair. The operation was performed amidst the fiercest yells and the most convulsive plunges. Once Bertha is secure, Rochester compares the wife he's stuck with to the wife he wanted, and defies anyone to judge him for what he's done. He then sends everyone away. Mr. Briggs stops Jane on the stairs to assure her she's absolved of all blame, and he reveals that it was her uncle in Madeira, now on his deathbed, who sent Mason to prevent the marriage. Her uncle had received her letter and happened to tell Mason of its contents, and Mason in turn told him about Bertha. So, in a cruel jab of irony, it was Jane herself whose actions stopped the wedding. Jane locks herself in her bedroom and mechanically changes back to her old clothes. She doesn't cry, but sinks down in exhaustion to reflect on her crushed hopes. Whew, it feels good to finally have that all out in the open. I've kept Bertha's identity under wraps through this whole adaptation comparison series, wanting to go through the book as written without taking the omniscient perspective, and it was tricky at times. I'm sure the plot twist that Rochester is already married and tries to get Jane to commit bigamy with him was shocking to Charlotte Bronte's Victorian readers, and I'm equally sure they were horrified by Bertha's introduction. It's only an introduction in the official sense, of course. We've already met Bertha. She's the woman whose strange laugh Jane has heard, who set fire to Rochester's bed, who almost killed Mason, her brother, and bit him with her teeth, and who visited Jane in the middle of the night and tore her wedding veil in 2. Now, a discussion of Bertha Mason or Bertha Rochester can take you into somewhat controversial territory concerning appropriate care of the mentally ill, whether Bertha's mixed race has anything to do with her treatment at Rochester's or Bronte's hands, and how Victorian marriage, divorce, and annulment laws would apply in this scenario. Oh, and the bigamy thing. I suppose bigamy could be viewed as controversial. Because I'm trying to keep this short, I know it doesn't seem like it, but I am, and because this is an overview of the scene, I'm not going to go into any of those topics. I will address one thing, though. Some literary critics in the last few decades have argued that Bertha wasn't really mad, or if she was, it's because Rochester made her go mad. The origin of this theory questioning Bertha's insanity seems to be Wide Sargasso Sea, the Jean Rhys novel published in 1966, over 100 years after Charlotte Bronte's death. The book, which has anti-colonial themes and portrays Bertha more as a victim than as an undeveloped antagonist, is one writer's personal hypothesis regarding Bertha's backstory. Debuting at a time when retellings of the classics were not prevalent the way they are today, and written in a unique style, the book got a lot of critical praise, was eventually adapted twice into a movie, and is now considered a modern classic. I can't really critique it because I haven't read it. I don't want to. I love Jane Eyre, but I don't crave any prequels, sequels, retellings. I don't need Rochester's point of view, or Adele's point of view, or retelling twists where Jane is a vampire hunter or a serial killer. No thanks. I'm good. More specifically, though, I admit Wide Sargasso Sea has always rubbed me the wrong way, I think because I hear some people refer to it as if it's the official prequel to Jane Eyre, and it isn't. Not at all. And I think Charlotte Brontë would be mortified by that idea. Anyway, when it comes to the question of Bertha's madness, I don't really get why some readers reject Jane's description of Bertha, why they claim it must be a false or inaccurate description. Were there people who were declared insane and locked up who weren't really crazy? Yes, I believe so. Was morally questionable or reprehensible behavior like drunkenness or promiscuity in a woman sometimes viewed as unlawful or insane behavior? I guess so, that's what I've heard, and those are things Rochester claims Bertha was guilty of. If she was locked up just for that, then yes, we should question the situation. But look at what we know about Bertha, what we have observed for ourselves. She sets things on fire and repeatedly exhibits destructive, homicidal behavior. That's not okay. I just can't go along with 21st century revisionist theory that argues something that I don't see the evidence of in the original text and that I don't think was the author's intent. And I don't really go for the madwoman in the attic psychological theory either, the idea that Jane and Bertha are mirror images of each other, or Bertha is the outward manifestation of Jane's inner turmoil and her latent, frustrated desires. It's a thought-provoking idea, and it's interesting to see adaptations play with it, to see how Bertha responds to and interacts with Jane. But, again, I don't feel that that's something presented in the book. And I'm one of those people that goes to the book as the primary source. There is more to say about Bertha, but for now I'm going to hold off on further discussion of her behavior and Rochester's handling of the situation. That is explained in further detail in the next chapter, so let's wait until we get there to go over that. At least I'm going to wait. I can't control any discussion in the comments. I know that some of you have eagerly been discussing Rochester's treatment of Bertha since I started this comparison series. That's okay, I like the enthusiasm. I do feel like I should put out a reminder, though, that we're sharing personal opinions and interpretations. Different people probably have different views. That's fine. I'm sharing my personal thoughts, and I welcome a variety of opinions in the discussion. Just remember, this is a 200-plus-year-old work of fiction. You don't need to get worked up about it and get carried away, and there's certainly no need to get nasty. Now, moving on to the adaptations, what you're all here to see, something distinctive about how the scene plays out in the book, I feel, is the relative minimalism of everyone's reactions. This is a huge bomb that gets dropped, but Jane, either because she's in shock or because she's just so good at controlling her emotions, remains calm. And Rochester, aside from some angry and colorful language for which the priest admonishes him because they are in church, is more resigned than explosive. We'll see, though, that not every adaptation plays it out that way. As should be the case, every adaptation includes the reveal of Rochester's secret wife. It's fundamental to the storyline, so any adaptation that leaves it out shouldn't call itself Jane Eyre. There are some things the films dwell on that the book only mentioned in passing or didn't mention at all. There's often a moment where Jane marvels at herself in the mirror before going downstairs. A couple versions emphasize the awkwardness of the abrupt return to Thornfield, and a few of them take a moment to show Bertha and Jane looking at each other, even implying that Bertha was docile until she saw Jane standing there in her wedding gown, and it was Jane that she was lunging for when Rochester stepped in. It's too bad in a way that I had to split this part up, as this section tends to flow from one scene into the next with a rising sense of urgency and there's something bad coming around the corner. We're also going to find that some versions take dialogue from the scene after this one and place it here due to the constraints of time and for narrative purposes. I'll lightly touch on that dialogue here, and then in the next comparison, I'll refer back to what was said in this scene to compare it with the book and other versions that follow the book more closely, if that makes sense. Okay, so here we go, starting with 1934, which once again is doing its own thing. We broke off last time in the middle of a scene where Rochester and Jane are having tea with the vicar and Grace Poole is running around in a panic when suddenly this lady wanders in.
Edward, my husband, I've come such a long way.
Well, that's awkward. This is Bertha, although she looks nothing like the character Brontë described. She's fully dressed, put together. She doesn't really seem crazy, more spacey and delusional. After assuming that she and Rochester are getting married again, or renewing their vows, she turns to Jane and asks if she's one of the wedding guests. Jane doesn't react much, just kind of looks at her with concern. As Bertha's led away by Grace and Mrs. Fairfax, she gets upset and becomes hysterical. Rochester tries to explain that their marriage was being annulled, but that does little to mollify the outraged vicar, who says he'll come back when Rochester has the necessary documentation. And once again, I'm going to cut it off here before Jane and Rochester's private conversation, which I'll take a look at in the next comparison. This one's gotta get low marks. It's watered down a lot of the climactic impact by changing Bertha's appearance and behavior, also by changing the circumstances. The marriage was about to be annulled. Rochester jumped the gun a little by getting engaged before separation was complete, but he still was delaying the marriage until he had the papers. So, it's still not great that he concealed his wife's existence, but it's a completely different situation. And I'm sure they did this because of the Hays Code. If you remember, the 1944 version went the montage route with the engagement period. That montage ends as the camera settles on a rear view of the wedding in progress, and shadows are cast as someone enters the building. I'm sure I needn't mention again that Joan Fontaine was much too pretty to play the part. Standing at the altar, Jane is clearly feeling the moment, but Rochester stares ahead, almost like a robot. Still, those who object to Orson Welles' hot-tempered Rochester may be surprised by how mellow he is here. Mason is the only one who raises his voice. Rochester does shout at the crowd gathered outside, but that's the only outburst you see from him in this scene. Back at Thornfield, Rochester throws open the door and is immediately attacked by his wife. We never really see Bertha here, so it's hard to judge if she looks as Brontë described. As with most things in this adaptation, the scene is shrouded in shadows and mystery. We do hear her, though, making angry dog-like snarls as she and Rochester struggle. This is exchanged for the rattle of chains or manacles as Rochester is able to get away. The scene ends with Rochester's desperate speech telling the men to look at the difference between the two women and then judge him. Everyone files out, Jane the last to go, and Rochester, now a broken man, closes the door on Bertha. I give this one credit for being so ominous as Rochester opens the door, and while I would have preferred to see Bertha, I also think there's something interesting about not showing her. It's like an application of the theory employed in some horror movies that that which is unseen is more effective than that which is seen. And this version certainly took a page out of the horror movie textbook. The 1970 version of The Wedding actually begins with a scene in which Mason saunters up to Thornfield's door, only to be told that Rochester's at the church getting married. Then we cut to the church, where they've already gotten to the part where they're exchanging vows. Mason comes in to stop the wedding himself, without the legal aid and protection of the solicitor. Mason shows a curious mix of timidity and defiance. Very interesting. A few words about Mason and Rochester. They have an odd relationship. They share this secret history, and legally they are brothers-in-law, so Rochester receives Mason at his house, cordially, but the appearance of friendliness between them is only skin deep, especially on Rochester's side. Rochester still holds it against Mason that he helped trick him into marrying his sister. He also insinuates that Mason may have a touch of that hereditary insanity. That may be true, or it may not. We don't exactly see evidence of it. Mason is described as a little sickly and weak. He's certainly not the robust type like Rochester, and he's kind of afraid of Rochester, which I'm sure makes Rochester respect him even less, if that's possible. Their relationship isn't the main focus, of course, but I find it's a good thing to pay attention to in this scene, as well as in other scenes that Mason appears in. Continuing on, Jane deflates upon hearing the news, and I feel like she's thinking, ugh, I knew things were going too well for me. We also get a quick reaction shot of Mrs. Fairfax. I really like how the scene in the church is played. Rochester doesn't say much, but what he does say is effective, and cutting out Briggs the middleman does make it feel a little more raw. I feel like the 24 seconds where Rochester puts Jane in the carriage and drives away could have been better spent, and the priest apparently decided not to come see Mrs. Rochester, though he was invited. The one thing I definitely would have changed is that they have Rochester say the line, "Such is the sole conjugal embrace I am ever to know," before Bertha attacks him. It's supposed to come directly after that. It gives it more bite. Bertha is played by Jean Marsh, the only time I'm familiar with the actress playing Bertha from something other than Jane Eyre. That's thanks to many childhood viewings of Return to Oz. I didn't notice at first, but it's not actually mentioned in the church that Bertha is mad, which makes her unpredictable behavior even more shocking to Jane. Bertha jumps on Rochester and pulls him down, but then she grows calm, perhaps because she recognizes him, and she strokes his face and relaxes, allowing him to ease away. It's quite apparent to me that Rochester does care about Bertha. He's gentle with her and won't hurt her to defend himself. He says he loved her once, and as several adaptations do in this scene, talks about the alternative, putting her in an asylum where she'd be abused and nobody would care for her. The scene closes with a powerful monologue, Rochester alone with his wife, looking ahead to the prospect of the rest of their life together, such as it is. I like this version of the scene. It departs from the book, yes, but I like the execution and the performances. Man, the 1970 version is really growing on me. The 1973 version goes a similar route as 1944 did, showing the two men enter as the priest reads the "any just cause why these two may not be lawfully joined together" line. This time, though, they exchange some dialogue.
No. He may yet himself recant.
I also really like this part where Rochester hears the approaching footsteps of doom. And then Mr. Briggs speaks up, and I've gotta say, I find him a little bit spooky, showing up there like the Grim Reaper, but I also kind of like him in all his serious, unperturbed professionalism and clear, deliberate enunciation. The perspective in adaptations of this scene often tends to be split 50-50 between Jane and Rochester, but this version does a good job of focusing on Jane as she registers each new piece of information. There's palpable tension again between Rochester and Mason, and the longer the scene goes on, the more eager Mason is to get away. Rochester's lengthy speech in the church is judiciously abridged, same with his speech in Bertha's room. If you do a side-by-side comparison, you may agree it's a good example of how trimming dialogue for the screen can improve it. This version gives us the first instance of the awkward return to the house where everyone waits to greet the newlyweds. Upstairs, Bertha quickly becomes upset at the sight of her visitors. Mason wants to leave, but Rochester insists they stay, pushing Jane out of harm's way as Bertha approaches. Here's something different.
You lie! You say you take me home.
Then for a second she acts subdued before going for the throat. Thank goodness for that high Victorian collar. Grace Poole helps him bind Bertha to a chair while the men look on in shock. Briggs is the only one who doesn't seem completely mortified by the display and can still look Rochester squarely in the eye. At last, Rochester sends them away, Bertha's mocking laughter ringing in their ears. It's not quite over yet, though. Briggs helps Jane down the stairs and explains about her uncle and his connection to Mason, one of those funny coincidences. Yes, I do always feel like, gee, it just so happens that Rochester's brother-in-law from halfway across the world is not only acquainted with Jane's long-lost uncle, but was with him when he got her letter. What are the chances of that? Mason suggests he could take Jane with him back to her uncle in Madeira, but Briggs recommends, what with the state of her uncle's health, it would be better for her to wait until she hears from or of him. It's nice of them to be so considerate of her future, despite the fact they just ruined her big day. 1983 is the only version that starts the scene in a peppy way with a pleasant little walk to the church, la-di-da, it's so deceptively charming. The first red flag pops up when the priest is all, isn't this such a happy occasion, and Rochester tells him basically to get on with it. The scene then skips ahead to the pertinent part of the ceremony, pregnant pause while the priest waits for any objection, there's nothing, and then finally an echoey disembodied voice from the back interrupts him. Jane whips around real quick, but while the owner of the voice steps forward, Rochester continues to stand there stoically. Only when there's mention of a wife now living does he do a dramatic turn. And then the episode ends, so you've got to wait through the credits and a recap of the last 30 seconds for the scene to continue. I know this version is on Amazon Prime. I don't know if the streamed version skips past all that. I like this Briggs too. I don't know, that character, unbothered, unintimidated, refusing to back down from his duty, just makes for such good contrast. Rochester does his best, especially in this version, to cow and discredit the interlopers, but Briggs ain't having it. It's Mason's entrance that seems to provoke Rochester the most. They have a grim standoff before Rochester says, "Fine, everybody come meet my wife." This version passes over Rochester's monologue in the church, or rather it moves it to the scene in Bertha's chamber. Bertha stays quiet as they file in, as if she doesn't even notice they're there, but when Rochester speaks to Grace Poole and turns his back, Bertha jumps on him. He quickly overpowers her with the help of Grace and Briggs, who's startled but not unable or unwilling to take action. Then, as Bertha lies tied down and squirming on her bed, Rochester explains the circumstances of their marriage, the trap, the madness that runs in the family, possibly including Richard, who looks very ill in the corner. Then, defeated, Rochester dismisses everyone as he sits by his wife and tenderly takes her hand. But wait, there's more! As Jane makes her way downstairs, Briggs hurries after her to inform her of her uncle's role and of his imminent demise. It's just one more piece of devastating news for poor, dazed Jane to take in. In the 1996 version, servants help Jane get ready, and she marvels at her reflection as if she doesn't recognize herself, a throwback also to a previous scene where she stares at herself in a mirror. There's lots of hubbub in the house as luggage is being brought down and Rochester's making sure they're ready to leave ASAP. He goes looking for Jane and she meets him halfway. Clearly they weren't worried about the superstition that the groom can't see the bride. I can't remember if I've mentioned this already, but all of Jane's costumes in this film are gorgeous. Nice fabrics, exquisite tailoring, tastefully designed for Jane's character, but still appropriately elegant for this very aesthetic production. This is one of the best bridal gowns, and I like the gauzy modest veil, the low-profile bonnet, the little cape. It's a really nice costume design, and not so reflective of the decade the movie was made that it doesn't age well. Back to the scene at hand, Rochester asks Jane if she has any regrets, and she responds only that Adele has gone away to school and won't get to see her in the dress, so he promises to have her portrait painted. It's different, but nice. Then he puts a ring on her finger, which, well, if it's the engagement ring, it's kind of late. If it's the wedding ring, which I doubt, it's too early. We then cut quickly between the two men arriving at the church, Jane and Rochester at the ceremony, and Mrs. Fairfax watching from a distance. We dwell on Mrs. Fairfax for such a long time that it's impossible not to notice how anxious she looks. Really, Mrs. Fairfax, how much do you know? What's funny to me in this version is that for the most part, William Hurts is the mild-mannered, low-energy Rochester, yet in this scene he gives one of the most vitriolic reactions, both in the church and in Bertha's room. It's kind of startling. The film builds up to the reveal of Briggs's surprise witness, Mason, played again by Edward D'Souza 23 years after he did it in 1973. The drama might be played up a bit too much. We get another shot of Mrs. Fairfax looking shocked or dismayed or justified, I'm not sure. Rochester also seems stunned by Mason's appearance, I guess because he expected Mason would never be willing to come to Thornfield again after what happened last time. We leave the church after yet another shot of Mrs. Fairfax, now looking emotional. Then there's an artistic shot of the parade up the stairs. Grace Poole hears them and rushes to close Bertha's door, but Rochester's coming in. Bertha's on edge, disturbed by the people and the noise, not sure what to do, avoiding eye contact, until Jane comes in and lifts her veil. They lock eyes while Rochester is shouting about how he and Bertha got married, a combination of the speech in the church and dialogue taken from the scene after this one. Rochester's long-simmering outrage over the past injustice he suffered is now fully unleashed. No one's really looking at Bertha anymore while his story winds down, leaving him with nothing but bitter sarcasm as he compares the two brides. No one notices Bertha bending near the fire until she picks up a torch and charges with it toward Jane. All hell breaks loose, but Jane calmly replaces her veil and retreats to the quiet haven of her room. The 1997 version starts with Jane looking at her reflection in astonishment, then turning to Mrs. Fairfax, asking for her approval. Mrs. Fairfax doesn't exactly say yes. Jane promises she'll make Rochester happy, but I'm thinking it's not him Mrs. Fairfax is worried about. Scenes of the ceremony, where Jane and Rochester are both at ease, are intercut with shots of a man galloping frantically on horseback. Just as he seems to have missed his chance, he comes bursting into the church, and it's very dramatic, with slow motion and a symbolic ring falling to the floor. The uninvited guest, of course, is Mason, desperate to stop the wedding, and Rochester goes from 0 to 10 real quick.
I saw her with my own eyes not 3 months ago. No! I'm sorry.
This Mason is much more confident, not hiding in Briggs's shadow or cowering in fear of Rochester or his sister. Obscured by her veil, Jane looks even smaller and more childlike as her dream is taken away from her. Once again, Mrs. Fairfax watches in horror from a distance. Rochester yanks Jane from the altar, accidentally stepping on the wedding band as he leads everyone away to meet his wife. Mrs. Fairfax has the presence of mind to send the rest of the female staff back to work and have Adele taken far away from the scene that's about to unfold upstairs. The door to Bertha's room is opened, and we see the closest thing to a padded cell you'll find outside of a psychiatric hospital. They went in a slightly different direction with this Bertha. I'm not sure which trait is more noticeable, her wild hair or her large bosom. She essentially presents herself to Rochester, and when he rejects her, she lunges at him. She cries out as they subdue her. Her words are either gibberish or spoken in another language. Mason still tries to claim the moral high ground, so Rochester explains the truth of the situation, once again merging the church speech with dialogue from the next scene in the book. If the priest's side eye is any indication, Rochester succeeds in putting Mason in his place, while the camera roves around this shabby, crowded room, and Mrs. Fairfax holds on to Jane protectively. By the end of it, a desperate Rochester is clearly at the end of his rope, yet he still goes over to Bertha and puts his arms around her, showing her more affection than her brother does. Dropping a final kiss on her head, he exits the room, awkwardly leaving everyone else behind with Bertha and Grace Poole. In the hall, a very upset Mrs. Fairfax comforts Jane, saying she knew there was a patient, but she assumed it was Adele's mother. Well, somebody addressed my burning question of how much Mrs. Fairfax knew. On the morning of the wedding in the 2006 version, Sophie, the French girl who helps with Adele, keeps readjusting Jane's gown until Jane's had enough of being fussed over, but Sophie insists that Jane look at herself before she goes downstairs, making this the third adaptation in a row to dwell on this moment. Rochester's pacing downstairs. When Jane appears, he's almost derelict in his duty as the groom who's supposed to gaze at his bride in awe. He does pause, however, to compliment her, before rushing off to the church at breakneck speed. It's like he knows that Mason and Briggs are hard on his heels. Jane finally tugs on his hand to get him to take a break, and he apologizes for rushing her, but then they're off again. At the altar, Jane looks like a happy bride, while Rochester looks like he might slay everyone in sight at the least provocation. Then Briggs strides in to interrupt the wedding. Mason sheepishly comes in a moment later, and this is the first adaptation where Rochester loses his temper and lays a hand on Mason. I'm not crazy about that, though it's an understandable reaction. Off they go back down the hill to Thornfield, and I find this the most painful version of their return, where the staff are lined up to clap and cheer their congratulations, and Adele throws flower petals in the air, and Rochester barks at them that they're 15 years too late. I've always wondered, how on earth do they explain all this to Adele? Rochester brings them up to the tower and into the locked room, where we see the red scarf that Jane has spotted at the window several times in this version. We see Bertha sitting at a table, and in this version, we recognize her from Rochester's flashbacks. Unlike previous Berthas, who are typically older, unkempt, and decidedly unattractive, this Bertha retains the exotic beauty that must have caught Rochester's attention 15 years ago. The first impression is disarming. She smiles and waves a hand of welcome to her guests, until she sees Jane. Whether it's because she dislikes the sight of wedding clothes, she doesn't want a rival in her room, or she recognizes Jane, her expression changes. She starts cursing at her in Spanish, so I guess it is personal. She goes for Jane, but Rochester blocks her. Everyone else rushes out of the room while they struggle. Once they've got her down on the floor, roaring with rage, Grace Poole tells him to leave. Rochester joins the group, locking the door behind him. He takes advantage of the silence to tell the story of how he met Bertha through flashbacks. This is the detailed version, more like what he tells Jane privately in the next scene in the book, so I guess I'll come back to this in the next video. I don't necessarily have a problem with how they moved things around here. It's a very emotional scene coming off the meeting with Bertha. It's well played. We see Rochester and Jane utterly brokenhearted. I could quibble over the fact that we see Jane shed some tears, and she's not supposed to cry during this whole thing, but I don't feel like it. One of the shortest adaptations of this sequence, the 2011 version, starts with Jane getting dressed, Adele looking on and being cute. Jane comes outside and exchanges some final words with Mrs. Fairfax, but Rochester abruptly breaks it up to whisk Jane away to the church. It's no big surprise when Jane starts panting. They're moving fast and uphill, and I doubt Jane's used to this kind of vigorous activity. During the ceremony, Rochester looks impatient, like any second he's going to order the priest to just say man and wife and be done with it. His behavior is even more shifty during the obligatory pause for an objection, so it's almost a relief when, without much preamble, Briggs interrupts. Mason kind of slinks in while he's reading the affidavit, and upon sight of him, Rochester marches forward and starts to strangle him. Whoa! 2006 Rochester's aggressive reaction is almost tame by comparison. Jane hangs back while the priest rushes to break them up. That's a wise decision. Rochester Rochester doesn't give the whole speech here, only the part that absolves Jane of wrongdoing. In fact, he never does give an explanation to the priest or the solicitor. The script saves all that for the private conversation with Jane later. They rush back to the house where, again, they're greeted by the staff and Adele tosses flower petals in the air. Oof. They find Bertha sitting on the floor, and the sound of her humming is amplified over Mason's attempts to speak to her and Grace Poole's warnings. Grace explains why the windows are boarded up and there's no furniture in the room. This Bertha, who is attractive like her predecessor, is also much younger than the other Mrs. Rochesters. If she married Rochester 15 years ago, she must have been awfully young. She restlessly turns to her visitors, then turns away, eventually approaching Rochester and embracing him possessively, defiantly in front of Jane. She spits at Jane, and something black lands on her dress. Then she breaks away from Rochester and starts slapping and scratching him. As she's wrestled down to the ground, Jane rushes from the room and Bertha screams, going back to her own room to hurriedly remove her wedding dress. So that's the wedding scene. It's not one of my favorite scenes, and this is not a comparison that I was looking forward to doing, but it had to be done, and I hope you enjoyed it. It's pretty amazing how different all of the interpretations turned out to be. They're all working from the same material, the same half a dozen pages or so, yet they came up with all these variations, whether it's how they cast Bertha, what kind of room they placed her in, or how Rochester responds when confronted with the truth. It's also interesting to see how certain imagery changed or became customary over time, and how trends developed, like how recent Berthas have been beautiful, sensual women, as opposed to put it very bluntly, the overweight hags of the past. But you do get an idea of what elements newer versions might have adopted from older versions, and what modern adaptations might be more interested in showing or focusing on, as opposed to the more traditional focus. I hope you enjoyed this adaptation comparison. I am curious to hear what everyone has to say about this particular scene, so go ahead and share your thoughts on it in the comments below. The next scene follows closely on the heels of this one, so I will try to get that done as quickly as possible, although every time I make one of these, I need a little break from it for a while. But I will try to get that done, and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching!